Okay. We just finished talking about the classical age of Greek history, focusing specifically on Athens. And Athens is rebuilding and doing quite a bit. So let's talk about, about what happens afterwards, right? Okay, so Herodotus. Now, I think I mentioned Herodotus a little bit earlier. Herodotus is considered the father of history because he is the first one to try to write down as much and as accurate and as detailed a historical account of events and people as possible. However, we have to remember that he's Greek, and because he's an ancient Greek, he's very, very prideful, which means that his writings are definitely colored by his prejudice. Any non-Greek person is seen as a barbarian and inferior to the Greeks. And it is from Herodotus where we get the vast majority of our, I say the vast majority, it's where we get a lot of information from sort of the first and the earliest Greek days. Thucydides was the next great historian after Herodotus, and he's the guy who gave us or who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. And this is one of the most carefully detailed and one of the oldest records of war, as well as the destruction of a way of life. As we saw earlier, Athens became very strong, very proud. Sparta became concerned about coming under Athenian rule. And remember, Spartans are not Athenians. They are very, very different. Very, very different cultures, very, very different ways of life. The Spartans are a little bit concerned, and they develop a coalition to challenge Athens. Each side had some sort of great strength. Athens had a great navy, which keeps them safe from siege. Sparta very much has a formidable infantry or ground force. And as the Spartans came crashing through the landscape, refugees piled into Athens. So Athens knows that it cannot really confront Sparta on land. Sparta knows they cannot really confront Athens on sea, so they're each trying to play to their strengths. So as the Athenians hang out in the city, plague strikes the city. Basically, there's just a sickness that goes around, and as much as a fourth of the population, including Pericles, died from the disease. Athenian leadership ultimately fell to lesser men, and there were several bad decisions which took place. In the year 416, the island of Melos sought neutrality. They didn't really want to, they said, we don't have a dog in this fight. Let's just keep us out of it. Athens, however, disagreed and eventually killed every man, taking the women and children as slaves. And people obviously were not happy about this. Then one of the Athenian leaders convinced the polis to interfere in a dispute between two distant Greek city-states. When they did this, they lost at least 200 ships and somewhere around about 40,000 men. These two decreases were basically the turning points in the Peloponnesian War. 8 years later, the city simply couldn't fight anymore and ultimately succumbed to defeat. After defeat, Athenians agreed to tear down its defensive walls. They reduced their navy to only 12 triremes, and they kept a small contingent of Spartan soldiers in the city. This was an occupied city. And basically the great city of Athens was no more, and it would never rise again, which ultimately causes the Athenians and Greeks all around to ponder or to question the meaning of loss. And this is where we get some of the most well-known, most famous philosophical musings. Athenians in particular are questioning justice, the meaning of life. Socrates, sort of starting us off here, Socrates supposedly heard an oracle say when he was young that there was no one wiser than he, so he spent the rest of his life wandering around asking people questions to see if he could find someone wiser than himself. He was pretty forceful in trying to get people to analyze their beliefs, as well as to contemplate the consequences of Athenian ideas of superiority. And eventually he came to believe the oracle, that he was the wisest man on earth, or at least in Greece, because he saw himself as the only one who knew that he knew nothing, that people in general know nothing, and that true wisdom lies in the endless search for knowledge. That wisdom lies in the endless search of knowledge. You must always go out and seek knowledge, and that is where wisdom comes. If you ever stop seeking knowledge, then you are not wise. He started to teach others, and his method of teaching was by asking questions instead of answering questions straight out. So his most famous student, Plato, if Plato had a question, Socrates would answer him with another question, and this is referred to as the Socratic method of teaching, still used today. It's very effective. After the war, the Greeks were definitely not happy to listen to Socrates' musing on Athenian faults. They didn't want to hear anybody say, "Hey, you want to know something? We probably should have lost, because look at how we're wrong in all these different places." So eventually, he was brought to trial, and he was charged with impiety. Remember that, as well as corruption of the young, and he received the death penalty. And he drank a poison hemlock. Again, his most famous follower was Plato. Plato wrote down many of Socrates' sayings and thoughts, so whatever we have from Socrates is actually from Plato. Plato is also famous for establishing a school in Athens called the Academy to educate young Greek men in philosophy. His best-known writing is probably the Republic, in which Plato outlined his ideal form of government, but he also discusses the nature of justice and the reasons people should never commit injustice. Now, this type of government basically would operate best, or would really only operate, if it had a philosopher king. Okay, so not just a king, certainly not a democracy. You must have a philosopher, one who loves wisdom, one who, like Socrates, would constantly search for knowledge until their dying breath, but they should be a king. So not giving the people any power. Very, very different from Athenian thought. He argued that democracy would not produce justice because people cannot rise above their own self-interest. So you can't trust people, basically, right? Like, people will always seek out whatever it is that they want rather than the good of everyone. So you must have a king in charge, but a king who loves wisdom, who's constantly seeking out wisdom, and therefore constantly seeking the most good for the most people. As he led discussions in the Academy, one essential idea pervaded all his teachings, and that is ultimate moral qualities are universal. They're unchanging. They're absolute. They are not relative. So there is an eternal truth, and morality, it cannot be changed. Things are either right or they are wrong. Therefore, the only government that could work was with the king, or an oligarchy that was enlightened through philosophy. Plato's most famous student was Aristotle. Aristotle studied at the Academy, and he spent the next 20 years thinking, kind of a good thing for a philosopher to do. But he also debated, and he wrote. He differed from his teacher in politics in that he thought the ideal state was a small polis with a mixed constitution as well as a powerful middle class in order to prevent extremes. His concern was that, well, if you have a king, you can have a tyrant. And if you have the people in charge, then you have mob rule. So how do we prevent either one? Well, let's have a constitution. Let's have the middle class being very powerful so you can keep the very poor and the very rich in check. His own life-guiding philosophy was practical reasoning. Therefore, democracy could not work because, once again, most people are generally less interested in a life of philosophy and would not or could not make the best decisions for the general welfare of the people. So, in other words, Plato and Aristotle both said you cannot trust the good of all with all. There must be a select few, whether one or a small grouping, of people who love wisdom, philosophers, because those people will be the ones to actually bring about the most good. They are going to be the ones who understand that you cannot do just for a few. You must do for all. Aristotle became incredibly influential in the school he founded called the Lyceum, as well as through his writings. But his most famous student would be the one man to take Greek culture and Greek knowledge to the rest of the known world. And his name was Alexander. So we will leave the Greeks here, or at least these kinds of Greeks, and we will pick up next time with the Hellenistic age, and this is when we discuss Alexander the Great.